live, and we are here. Obviously, we're not somewhere else, and we're going to pray. Father, in Jesus' name, help us because we need it right now. And we're very grateful to be able to be here, and that even if we're tired, that at least we're laughing and we're having a nice time with you today in your house. And we ask that you would be with us through this message, everybody who watches it, everybody who's going to watch it live, everybody who's going to watch it later, as well as those of us who are here. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, that's all I got for the time being. All right, so my message is, does size matter? And for all those filthy people on the internet who are going to click on this because they think I'm talking about something else, actually, I did address that on a podcast. But we're not going to be talking about that today. We're talking about church size. So when people think about things and the size of different things, we often have certain associations. So what God reminded me of this morning was that when I was in second grade, I was in a classroom that had 31 kids in it. Okay, now you just responded, wow. Okay, you just responded to that in a way that's exactly what we were going to go for. And I remember when I was going to go to school there because I came from another school, and there were like 12 kids in that class that was in the school I was in, because there were so many kids, they broke us off into 3 classrooms, and I was like in this lingering little new class. I went from that to 30. There were already 30 kids in the classroom. And the principal, I remember sitting on my mother's lap in this dress that was my sister's that looked kind of like wallpaper, and a hooded blue sweatshirt because I was cold. And he was debating whether or not he was going to let me in because there were so many kids. Now, in hindsight, you said to me he really couldn't tell me no because this was public school. That he really couldn't tell me no, but that, he wasn't really sure about it. And we all had a number. We were all numbered 1 to 31. And so guess who was 31 because they were the last student? And imagine being in a room like that. Now, this was the very early 90s, late 80s, early 90s at the time. And that room at times was complete and total mayhem. And then we got into the following grade, which was third grade, and they didn't break up our class. And they didn't break up our class probably due to space. And so they put us all into one room, and you better believe that there were a whole lot of issues there. But you immediately had a response to that because now we've kind of come to assume that large class sizes and large schools aren't really a great idea. That packing everybody in like sardines and running them through the mill meant that some kids didn't know how to read well.
And poor teachers.
And,
to control a class of 30 plus students.
My second grade teacher retired 2 years after I was in her class. So that's perspective. She was not a young woman. And we've now decided that that's too many. Now we've got charter schools. Now we have this whole movement for private school. Now we've talked about homeschool. I mean, student teacher ratios, exactly. How one teacher can't manage 30 kids and da 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 da. And so we pretty much established that big, huge schools and big, huge classrooms aren't that great of an idea. Think about some other things on jobs. Okay, when corporations become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you have all these different departments. So you've got 30 departments in order to handle one client, and they've got to go through all these different things. We're kind of figuring out now that maybe that's too big. Maybe it's not a good thing, that maybe too big is a thing, okay? But we don't seem to have that approach when it comes to church. Okay, I came up, as I just said, if I was in second grade in 1989, you can all kind of figure out how old I am. So in the 90s, we had revival culture. And I'm not going to get into all the details of that because I've talked enough on different episodes and on different things about how we all were great with it until we found out that people were doing really weird things at these revivals, like barking, or what they called holy laughter, where they would just uncontrollably laugh and roll around on the floor. Okay, So we were all okay with stuff until we started hearing about some of it. And not all of those different movements had all those elements. Okay. And I think that that's important to say this. But the only thing that we judged these movements on, and the only reason we thought that they were revival, and the only reason why we thought God was moving these, because there were a lot of people there. That was the only reason. So it had to be revival because a lot of people were there. And then what we had was that all of this was going on and everybody was like, yeah, 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 and God is really moving. And so then all the churches wanted to be the one that had revival. And they were all fighting with each other. They were all trying to do different things and make new rooms in the church and do this and that. And then we started a few years after that getting into megachurch culture, which is the product of revivalist culture, that bigger is better and more is more, and we got to have a lot of people, and we got to do this and we got to do that. So then perfectly good pastors, perfectly good teachers, suddenly are up in the pulpit in ripped jeans, painted the thing black behind them and took the cross down, and are trying to mimic TV Jakes and Joyce Meyer and these big name people at the time. Kenneth Copeland was very, very big in those days before everyone thought he was a basket case, which they all do now. And, all of these, before all of this stuff kind of started to implode, which it happened during COVID, it happened during the Trump administration, all of these movements kind of started to implode. Everybody was trying to be like the big guys. So everybody got a slideshow projector, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with having it, but suddenly church budgets went from being about paying off the building's mortgage or trying to do a community outreach or maybe doing something for the community, homeless, or a feeding program or something, to lights and stages and sound booths and everybody trying to sound like Hillsong and everybody trying to sound like Elevation nowadays and everybody trying to I cannot tell you the number of copycat churches that emerged trying to be Hillsong, even in Australia. I remember seeing a couple of them on TV. And what am I going to tell you? They weren't Hillsong. They were okay. I mean, they might have had a couple of songs that were all right. There was this huge implosion of worship teams, and everybody was trying to be innovative and trying to be the next CC Winans and trying to be this one and that one. And so everybody became a copycat because everybody wanted to be bigger. And what I'm going to tell you is, because I was alive then and I am alive now, that absolutely none of these churches had what they wanted. There was no big, huge explosion of revival. They didn't fill their churches up to capacity. In fact, several of these churches, one or two I'm thinking of, one of the pastors died, and he was adamantly against women preachers. Wasn't going to happen, and so the person who took over the church was his daughter. You don't have any idea how much I was like, go, because, there isn't anybody else to do it. And so we can have all our values and we can have all our ideas, but when push came to shove, he died and there wasn't anybody to take over except her. And so she pretty much took over. Or, one of them, the pastors have changed out at least 2 or 3 times since one of them was there, and the church is not any bigger than it was. If anything, it's probably smaller because you had a few very long time members die because, hey, that still happens this side of heaven. So this bigger is better mindset took over and everybody stopped being unique. And it's funny because you were saying before we went on air about, how we're not necessarily ministers that need to be perky, because there's enough perky ministries. There's enough things. And then I said, so what, we're going to be sad sack ministries? And then you said the thing about being existential. And I started thinking as I was sitting there that we have a wider scope now as far as reaching people. And I'm going somewhere with this for later, than we've had at any time in the ministry I have had for 20 some odd years. Everybody's not in this room, but we are reaching more people. And I attribute it to that because I don't have a problem now getting on air and saying, yeah, it's a bad time, or yeah, people haven't always done right, or yeah, ministers hurt too, or yeah, I'm not a perky person. And that's just pretty much the beginning and the end of it. I was never one. Okay, I was never outgoing and bubbly and social, not at ever any one day in my entire life. Have I tried to do that at times? Yeah, but it didn't typically end any differently for me than the rest of the day. So this is an interesting thing because I think that we are often in church substituting quantity for quality, as they would say. And we think that as long as everything is huge, that it's legitimate. But Jesus himself said in John 7:24, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. And that is NIV 8, that's the 84 version because it is different in the new one. Stop judging by mere appearances. Just because a city is big doesn't mean it's a great city. Just because a city is small doesn't mean it's a great city. We cannot judge things exteriorly by these different things, but we do it with church. And we're making our legitimacy for a church based on how many people go. Well, if 1,000,000 people believe a foolish thing, it's still a foolish thing. Okay, 1,000,000 people can vote for somebody on American Idol, but if they can't sing, they can't sing. Or if they're not good, they're not good. I mean, that's just a fact of it. So, what does this tell us about church? Well, in Matthew 13, which is what I'm going to be reading from today, and we're going to talk about the stuff under that in a minute, Jesus uses several different examples of very small things that turn into other things. So the parable of the sower is what starts the chapter. That same day, this is NIV 84. Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. This is the passage you referenced in Sunday school. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore, standing room only. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. So I'm going to stop there for a second. So there's two things to take note of in here. First of all, the seed was small. Okay, there are no big seeds. There are no seeds the size of a boulder because that doesn't make sense for the earth because the seeds have to crack and they have to break open and there's a whole sacred geometry in there because it looks just like lightning and that the seeds have to grow. And so seeds always have to grow from something small. They have to be a small thing. They can't be a big, huge thing that would ruin the ground, that would ruin the earth. It would take up too many nutrients and you would not have the productivity with growing that you would have. And how do I know this? Plants. Okay, all the plants, okay? So it wouldn't work. But in this, so there's something powerful about small things. There's something about small things. Thank you. There's something about small things that contain something bigger or something greater or something that has the ability to multiply and do something else. And the evidence of this is that he's asked, why do you talk in parables? Well, most of the time people go, oh, they were short, simple lessons that everybody could understand. No, it says here that they were spoken because people weren't going to get them. That the only way that people were going to understand the parables was if they had faith. And if they had that small faith, that abiding faith, that would help them to understand the lesson later. So like everybody goes, oh, they were like for children. No, they weren't like for children. They were for people who were believing. They were discerning and separating the believer from the non-believer. The people who were going to be able to continue in this versus giving up on it or letting it go. Because it says they see, they don't see, they hear, they don't hear or understand. So in other words, they might have heard the story. They might have went, oh, okay, but they're going to think it's about seeds. They're going to think it's about running around and planting stuff and that you have to be careful where you plant. And that is true. I mean, that is a fact. That is something that you do have to do. But that's not what the story is really about. There's a spiritual lesson in here. And if you don't have faith and if you don't really understand things, then you're not going to be able to do what needs to be done. Verse 14, in them is filled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and in turn, I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they may hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So, little things, little stories, little examples that teach us about our faith. Jesus always used really common, everyday, ordinary things, little things that nobody thought about. And I'm thinking about Brother Lawrence as I'm up here talking, who was a monk, who got subject to be in the kitchen and literally started to find God in everything in his life. And actually, there are quite a few people in history who did that. Like, for example, there was Therese of Lisieux, who talked about the little way, and who, even though she was sickly, and even though maybe she was not able to do what other people in the convent did, she still sought God maybe in darning socks, or prayer, or silent contemplation, or in working in the garden, or something of that different nature. So these little ordinary everyday things are important. It's like I say, symbols are powerful. A lot of people nullify the idea of baptism as a symbol or communion as a symbol because they don't like the idea that we're saying it's symbolic. But symbols are powerful. They're important. They make a difference. They teach us something about something else. It's like types and shadows. So one of the things I remember you pointed out is that basically it's all communion. Baptism is death. We're dying and we're uniting in Christ. In communion, it's the memorial of Christ's death, that these objects are reminding us of the sacrifice he made. So it's all death and rebirth. It's all death and living again. It's all renewal. It's all communion in different ways. But we often don't think about that. Listen to what the parable of the sower means. Verse 18, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell on rocky places is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. So when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, he quickly falls away. The one who received the seed that fell among the thorns is the man who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. But the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the man who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown from seed, from tiny little things. So it's not always about volume, because if you have tons and tons and tons of seeds, that also is not going to work, because all of the roots entangle together and they don't grow properly. And so, I mean, in theory, people go, hey, if you got one seed, you've got seeds, you've got seeds, everybody's got seeds. It doesn't really quite work quite like that. So then Jesus talks about weeds. And I'm not actually going to read this particular one, but it's the same principle. So now the man sowed the good seed. So now he did the right thing. Same guy. Okay, same person, probably same parable. But the way that it's divided up, it sounds like it's two. So he did his thing right, and then the enemy comes and sows weeds among the wheat. And then they all grow up together. And so that's actually kind of got a wise leadership story in there, because the enemy came and also sowed something small. So small things do matter. You know, it says in the Song of Solomon that the little foxes spoil the vine. Little things do make a difference, and they do matter. And so there's somebody sowing something little that created a huge headache, created a big problem. And then what has to happen is you just got to let the wheat and the tares grow up together and wait until everything kind of gets sorted out in the end. So there's that one. Then he tells a parable, starting in verse 31, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it's the smallest of all your seeds, Yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. So mustard seeds are small and become a whole plant. Yeast is little and it creates a big, huge thing. So you put in some yeast, and you ever see that episode of I Love Lucy where she thinks it's 13 cakes of yeast instead of three? And she goes, oh, it's small, it's no big deal. And then the loaf is coming out of the oven. Yeah. It's very infamous picture in memes. I will find the meme. Okay. Hmm? Oh, it's a lot of bread. I mean, opens up the door of the oven and the bread loaf just comes out. Yes, so like that. Hmm? Your kind of bread. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Now, down in verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. So, same illustration. The treasure was small enough to bury. It wasn't this big, it wasn't a palace. I mean, we don't really know what it is. It's usually pictured like a D&D treasure chest, or it was the one piece though. But maybe it was the one piece and maybe that's what they were looking for. Hmm. Kind of like the one piece, but we don't know if it was just like a chest. Usually they picture like a treasure chest and their coins in it and stuff like that, or if it was jewels, or we don't know what it was. But it was small enough to bury. It was small enough that one guy could bury it. He didn't need to involve his friends. And so then he buries it and then he goes and buys the field. Now that's actually kind of smart. Very smart. Okay. And then we've got a guy who finds, looking for a pearl, finds one pearl and sells everything to buy that pearl. Now, they were probably a lot more valuable than they are now. I mean, in terms of you can go buy them and they're not really all that expensive depending on what you buy. But one thing, one little thing had that much value. And then they talk about a net, and then they talk about the prophet being without honor. And the reason why I'm going to not read all that, but I'm going to point out something in this particular passage, that the parables were used, like I said, to distinguish people. And then at the end, we have the prophet without honor. So Jesus finished the parables, right? Said all this great stuff, teaching all these people about faith. And people are offended by what he said. And it says, and they took offense at him. Well, isn't this just the carpenter's son? And isn't he just over here with his mother and his brothers and this and that? And he's teaching us all this stuff. And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, only in his hometown and in his own house is a prophet without honor. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. So in this story about small things, Jesus is following got smaller, because they didn't understand what he was saying. And so what we see as far as growth goes in terms of church and history are cycles. So you have multitudes of people liked Jesus when he was giving out free lunch and when he was talking about stuff that appealed to them. But the second it comes down to, no, this is not what your faith should be on, oh, then they go away and they don't have as many followers. And it even says that, and people went away sad because they didn't like what he said. So then you kind of have a group, and then things kind of shrink. And while Jesus was on earth, I counted, he served at least 84 people. So Jesus' church size in his lifetime was the 12, and then the 70 or the 72, depending on what translation you use. Some say 70, some say 72. So we're going to say 72 because it's only two people, and I don't know why we're going to quibble over two people, but we'll say that 72, so that's 84. So Jesus directly discipled and worked with and managed and led and grew 84 people in his 3-year ministry. It still is a lot of people. It still is maybe more than we might think. But It's not multitudes. It's not thousands of people. It's certainly not a megachurch. Okay, it's certainly not a huge group of people. And I'm going to also say that he didn't handle all of those people the same way, which I think is important to mention. So we always see him working with the 12. We don't see him doing a whole lot with the 72. We don't really know what the ministry with the 72 looked like, except that they knew enough to be sent out 2 by 2. So we don't know what their instruction was. Jesus had Peter, James, and John, and they knew Jesus in a certain way. And then there were 12, and then there were 72. So we're going to kind of use that as a model for movement growth. It kind of was here, and then here, and then here. And so mnemonics, it kind of expanded, and it kind of grew out, and it went out. But it certainly wasn't a megachurch. Jesus certainly did not have a megachurch. And then Jesus died. We don't know how many people stuck around. Okay? And so we're going to use this illustration. Then we've got the upper room, and it says there were 120 people in the upper room. Okay. That's going to be important. I'm going to explain something about that in a minute. So we have 120, and then we have another surge. And so from Pentecost, in the Pentecost experience, there were 5,000 people who converted that day. Okay, and now everybody thinks that they just raced off and that was the first megachurch. First of all, the Bible says that those were believers from other places. So we don't know how many of them stuck with it once they went home, because when they went home, there were no churches there. Okay, unless there were, and we don't know about it, but I'm going to say probably not, because it was too many people in too many different places for there to be people everywhere. Now, what I'm going to say is that they probably recognized the need to go other places from that experience at Pentecost, but 5,000 people did not all leave their homes and their families and join the Church of Jerusalem. It's not what happened. So how many of them stuck with it, we really don't know. But over and over and over again in the Bible, and we can see here, church is spoken of as a household. And so there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 passages that speak of the household of God. That's why we did the song, God is in the House. Because that song is about, I think it's based on Psalm 68, but it's about the household of faith that, God came and found me, took me home, gave me a family, and I don't walk alone. Because that cannot be biological. That's not everybody's story. But there's this big, huge, long list here of churches that met in houses or were directly connected to households in Acts and all the way through to 2 Timothy. So in Acts 2:2, they were in a house. When they had Pentecost, they were in an upper room. There was somebody named Judas who had a house. It's not Judas Iscariot, but it's somebody named Judas. They all had the same names back then. And so Cornelius, so we had the household of Cornelius. We had Mary, the mother of John Mark, and so she had a house. Lydia, Aquila and Priscilla, Aristobulus, Narcissus, Chloe, Stephanus, Caesar, Nympha, and Onesiphorus. I think that's how you say that. All of them had different houses, and the church met in the house. Now, those upper rooms that we talked about. So I did some history on the upper room. And they seated in an average house about 50 to 60 people. Okay, now that's if somebody had the money to live like that. Okay, so we're also indicating that not everybody in the early church was poor, which I think is also an important thing to state, because a lot of people think that they were all just living on the street, eating out of trash cans. Apparently, some people in church, there were different statuses in church. And that explains more what was going on in James, where he's talking about, all right, somebody comes in of lesser status and has on different clothes, and then you look down. So there was a diversity in the early church of class and status and, all of that. And that kind of is very, very relevant for a lot of different things we're not going to get into. But apparently, the average house that had an upper room where they would have met seated about 50 to 60. You might have had some people that had something smaller that wasn't as big, that maybe wasn't an upper room, or they didn't have a banquet hall, but they really didn't live like people did now. So like, for example, people didn't just come and sit in your living room. That's a newer invention as far as house design goes. That would have been considered a private quarters in older times. So you've got this maybe 50, 60 people in a moderate banquet room. if they had a lot of money, they might have seated up to 150 people. Exactly. So about the same, there was 150 people. So there you go. Exactly. It's all kind of about the same. So what does this tell us? First of all, I think that what this all this information kind of tells us is that church design is not meant to be a megachurch. And I think that it's pretty safe that we can understand that, just like I gave the example of being in second grade with 31 kids in the class and my teacher trying to handle everybody. And this is from the days before teachers' aides and all that sort of stuff really became a thing. So the only aides we had were in the lunchroom, and they were typically retired teachers or older women that wanted something to do, and they would come in for a couple hours and watch the kids at lunch and at recess. So there were no aides in the room. There was nobody coming in and helping out. There wasn't anybody doing it. This is that teacher with 31 kids all day trying to teach everybody at different levels, everybody with different levels of understanding, everybody trying to kind of put stuff together, different home situations. This was a school where they took in a lot of kids who had emotional or learning problems or stuff like that. One teacher for all those kids. Okay, we can say that that's a bad idea. There's a reason that the church talks about pluralities of people, pluralities of pastors, elders, there to assist pastors, that we have apostles, that we have different people working together for churches. And like we're talking about, you mentioned the church at Ephesus and Timothy with Ephesus. Well, John also wrote a letter to Ephesus and Paul wrote a letter to Ephesus. So it wasn't just Timothy is there and Timothy's going to lead the church at Ephesus. There was a plurality of people, even on the administrative level, that helped out. So that's important. We kind of figure it out if we look at the Bible, that if you're trying to lead 150 people or even 50 people, you need help. You can't just do it by yourself. But we don't seem to understand that when it comes to church. And we don't seem to get that message that this system, that what we had in the first century, is a better idea than what we're trying to do today. So I did a little research, and I have to go find my stats because they're kind of important. So basically, there was no church group meeting in a house in the first century that was over 150 people. Okay? The system that we have now with theater style and all that, that's a later creation that came in after Constantine in the 300s. So then I looked up the average church size in the United States, and what I found was kind of interesting. The average, I found different stats. I think that that's important, and I guess it depends on who's doing it. But the number that stood out to me is the average church congregation in the United States is 134 people. So in other words, things have gotten bigger, things have gotten smaller. Things have gotten bigger in history, things have gotten smaller in history. But even down all these years and all this day and age, the average church size is still about what it was in the first century. And that ought to tell us something. And I'm going to say that that's probably a worldwide average. And why I'm going to say that is because there's an awful lot of believers who have to meet in houses in a lot of countries in the world today. So they're not going to have mega churches in Saudi Arabia because they're not a thing. Or they're not going to have a mega church in Myanmar. Yeah, that's a good thing. I was trying to think, and of course, I'm thinking the only country that's coming to mind is Nigeria, where there's a mega church that's like 800,000 people, and I went, okay, that's not going to work. But yeah, and look at the face. Can you even fathom that? That's like the population of Charlotte. One church. The average, I would say the average church size is about what it was in the early church. The difference is that we're trying too hard to be everybody else. We're trying to compete with churches like Elevation that we don't have the resources or the political backing or the social graces to compete with. Okay, we just don't have it. But maybe if the church would do what it was doing and stop being all about size mattering, maybe we could have an impact like the first church did. Because we're not having that impact because we're so worried about what everybody else is doing and trying to fit into a modern day mold that it's not working. You know what? Every one of us who's here today likes K-pop idols, and we like their style and we like what they do, but we can pretty much accept we're not a K-pop idol. Okay? When I walk up on a stage, nobody throws things at my feet. Nobody's ever thrown a Pokemon stuffed toy. If you want to, it's okay. I'm not going to argue with it. But, I like Litwick. I like what is the Rosalia. I like Crustal. Okay. I like Charmander. That would be an easy one to find. I'm trying to think of the unusual ones. I go, I really like this one. I got one the other day. I don't remember what it was though, but I really liked it. Oh, the Shamaine, or the the one that looks like a little armadillo. No, it's like it's I don't remember. It's not important. I mean, we're not going to say when this, but it's got flowers on its head, and you know the one I'm talking about. Okay, I'll show you later. Anyway, but I mean, I'm not going to argue, but we're not having the same purpose. And maybe the church needs to be about its purpose rather than about trying to expand all the time. Because just because you have tons of people doesn't mean that you're doing the right thing. And I've heard it once said, and I'm going to close with this, which it quotes, my least favorite person to bring up in these things. But it says, don't worry about size compared to different things, because Hitler had millions. Jesus had 12.